I would now like to invite Dr. Varaprasad, Live Trustee of SINDA and former CEO of Temasek Polytechnic and National Library Board, on stage to deliver his personal reflections. Dr. Varaprasad, please.
Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong, Mrs. Lee, on behalf of the Indian community, I would like to express our deepest condolences of the community to you and your family on the passing of Mr. Lee Kuan Yew. When Mr. Lee Kuan Yew returned home to Singapore after his highly successful studies in England, he joined the law firm of Laycock and Ong. John Laycock stood for elections to the Legislative Assembly in 1951, and Mr. Lee became his election agent. The following year, in 1952, the Singapore Union of Postal and Telecommunication Workers went on strike for better pay and conditions and approached John Laycock for a lawyer to represent them. The trade union was led by one G. Kandasamy, who was a co-founder not only of that trade union, but others as well. Laycock then referred Kandasamy to the young Lee Kuan Yew. Thus was the first connect between Mr. Lee and the leader of the Singapore Indian community, and also the first connect between Mr. Lee and his fight for labor rights. As is well known, this case opened the door for the young Lee Kuan Yew to become legal advisor to other trade unions and clan associations. He won public attention through various high-profile cases and his successful fight for local civil servants to receive the same benefits as their European colleagues. Now, I mention this for a good reason. Trade unions at that time, especially those representing public employees, such as the postal workers and port workers, had large numbers of Indians as their members. Therefore, Mr. Lee Kuan Yew's affiliation with the Singapore Indian community can be traced very far back, and he worked closely since then with their leaders and their members. Mr. Lee's support of the minority communities was both political as well as instinctive. He truly believed in interracial politics and that it was the performance of the individual that mattered, that counted, not his or her ethnicity. Yet, he was aware that to carry the ground, he had to ensure that all races had to be represented. On the inauguration day of the PAP on 21st November 1954 at the Victoria Memorial Hall, the 14 conveners of the inaugural meeting were Lee Kuan Yew, Toh Chin Chye, S. Rajaratnam, Fong Swee Suan, Devan Nair, Abdul Samad Ismail, Tan Wee Tiong, Mofradi bin Haji Muhammad Nur, a hospital worker, school teachers Tan Wee Keng and Chan Chiao Toh, as well as unionist P. Govindasamy, Ismail Rahim, Lee Gek Singh, and A.A. Karupaya. Why do I read this out? Fully 7 of the 14 of the convening party, conveners of the PAP inaugural meeting, were minority communities. The multiracial composition of the PAP conveners was clear evidence of how Mr. Lee regarded the minority communities, not as minorities, but as part and parcel of the larger Singapore family. Indeed, this became his rationale for his Malaysia concept and the Malaysia Solidarity Convention, and ultimately the cause of the separation of Singapore from Malaysia to become an independent, sovereign state of its own. The Indian community, itself an amalgam of many sub-communities, is therefore greatly indebted to Mr. Lee for giving them their space and providing them with equal opportunity, something that they did not enjoy even in their own homeland. Mr. Lee took special care in ensuring that Singapore's different communities would all share in its prosperity. This is visible in many policies. For example, Mr. Lee chose to enshrine English as the language of business, and Mandarin, Malay, and Tamil remained as official languages in Singapore. It is amazing that a community comprising 5% of the population has its language taught in school, has radio and TV channels, a language month, official signs and circulars in their language, parliamentary translation included. While English would be the common lingua franca and the language that would give Singapore an edge in international arena, Mr. Lee also firmly believed that knowing one's mother tongue instills a sense of belonging to one's roots and increased self-confidence and self-respect. So he championed bilingualism. His motivation is summed up in his advice to his successors. Quote, "Never do to the minorities in Singapore that which happened to us when we were a minority in Malaysia. Always make sure that the Malays, the Indians had their space, can live their way of life, and have full equal opportunities and are not discriminated against. And at the same time, help them to upgrade, improve, and move forward," unquote. Indeed, if you had been watching the photo montage on stage, you would have noticed that Mr. Lee attended all the functions and events of the Indian community, donning a turban, accepting a garland in a Hindu temple, and chatting with the children. Today, these communities are bound by Mr. Lee's 3 tenets for progress. First, integrity and absence of corruption. Second, meritocracy, the best people for the best jobs. And thirdly, a fair, level playing field for everybody. It was interesting to read former Cabinet Minister Mr. S. Dhanabalan's eulogy on Mr. Lee. Mr. Dhanabalan was not convinced of the need for the group representation constituency concept. Here was a dilemma, a struggle between individual meritocracy on one hand, an idealistic position, and guaranteed minority representation, a pragmatic position on the other. In the end, Mr. Lee won his way, and the Singapore Parliament today has the unique distinction of having minority representation through direct elections. This is not to say that all the minority members and candidates are slipstreamed by the majority candidate. In many cases, it could well be the reverse. Mr. Lee Kuan Yew served Singapore and all of its people with outstanding and extraordinary dedication. He was a highly respected statesman, an outstanding politician, a devoted father, and a loving husband. He was our first Prime Minister and inspired leaders from several countries to emulate his clean, efficient, and effective governance of the nation. Today, Singapore stands as an exceptional nation because of Mr. Lee's firm and steady hand on the tiller in its formative years, as well as the continuous mentoring of his successors. The Indian community bids a fond farewell to this extraordinary man, our first Prime Minister, our founding father. Indeed, Mr. Lee's support was strongest among the Indian community. Such was the bond that he established among the pioneer Indian generation. The outpouring of emotion all over Singapore that we have witnessed this week is a powerful visual of this bond. He himself was not of the pioneer generation. He was the father of the pioneer generation. Farewell, Mr. Lee. You gave your life to Singapore. It is now time for you to rest. Let us carry on with your legacy and your vision.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Varaprasad.